Welcome to Leave Us Alone, the podcast that champions individual freedom and limited government. Grover Norquist is out today and the staff is taking over. I'm Mike Palicz, the Director of Tax Policy here at Americans for Tax Reform. If you're new here, this show is about one simple idea: government should stay out of our lives. Our coalition includes taxpayers, gun owners, homeschoolers, and others who want the government to leave them alone. Today, I'm with James Erwin of Americans for Tax Reform. Welcome, James.
Thank you for having me, Mike, on your podcast. This is ATR After Hours, as Grover and the adults have left the room.
Yeah, it's our time to shine.
We'll try and have a little bit of fun.
Well, key here, we are now past 100 days into the Trump administration. We're going to talk about some of the achievements that Trump has had so early in office. James, would you like to kick us off?
I would, Mike. Thank you very much. So there are many retrospectives that we're starting to hear in the media. You know, the first 100 days is a little bit artificial because it's a holdover from when FDR was president. Nobody ever used to care about this, but ever since he decided to brand his first 100 days as aggressive action to combat the Depression, most of which didn't end up working. But ever since then, every president has lived in the shadow of this idea that the first 3 months you have in office are going to be your most consequential. And, you know, there's some truth to the idea that you have more political capital then that perhaps goes down over time, but you never actually know what controls events. I mean, you think about George W. Bush's first 100 days. Nobody remembers what happened there. They remember what happened after September 11th, 2001, going onward. I think it's fair to say that President Trump's greatest legislative accomplishments certainly were, and even his trade accomplishments from the first term were really in the end of the first into the second year. It's a bit artificial, but the White House is celebrating it. They are putting out what they've accomplished. They've been very aggressive in executive action. But what I'm not seeing in a lot of the coverage is what has happened legislatively. You know, there have been a few bills signed, but one of the things that's really kind of slipped under the radar in the media coverage are the CRAs. These are the resolutions of disapproval under the Congressional Review Act. And this is how Congress can repeal rules passed within the last 60 legislative days of the previous presidential administration. So these are bureaucratic mandates that nobody voted for that Congress has the right to knock down. And if there's a
lot of this is the midnight regulations that the previous administration tries to put in, right? So
exactly.
Even Biden knowing he's not coming back and the Democrats have lost the White House, they scramble to do last minute administrative actions to set booby traps for the incoming administration.
Right. And in a lot of ways, it doesn't even make any sense because if a CRA successfully passes, it salts the earth, so to speak, which is it makes it impossible and illegal for any bureaucrat in the future to promulgate a substantially similar regulation. So it's really kind of self-defeating to do it because all you're doing is setting yourself up to make sure that not only does the real rule get repealed, but that no future administration could possibly reimpose it. So we thank them for doing this because it does give a Republican trifecta an opportunity to liberate the market from their mandates.
So what are some of the good CRAs we've seen? And then we'll get into some of the good actions and executive orders from the Trump administration as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the big one that I was tracking was the IRS's digital asset rule. So this is where they tried to define developers of software that deal with cryptocurrency as brokers. Basically, you would have to register and be taxed as a cryptocurrency broker, like an asset or securities broker would, who trades stocks, if you were involved in any way in the crypto market. And it was an absurd expansion of that definition that was going to allow the IRS to stick its fingers into the digital wallets of so many people who honestly might not even have anything to do with the market besides owning a little bit of cryptocurrency themselves, but who are developing products and software that make it easier for other people to engage in the market and trying to democratize and decentralize finance and do it in a way that preserves a lot of anonymity. I mean, that's what attracts a lot of people to cryptocurrency in the first place, is they don't want the government snooping on every transaction they make. They don't want to have to register and report everything they do. So this was an attempt to violate the privacy of the very people who are trying to simply enable these transactions, as well as squeeze them for tax revenue. But I mean, I think more importantly, long term for the proponents of this rule was they wanted to create a registry of everybody who's involved in the market, because these are the types of people who don't want the government to put them on a registry. They want to be left alone. So thankfully, Congress has passed, this has gone through both houses of Congress, and the president has signed a repeal of that rule, and it can never be brought back again. So the IRS is now prohibited in law from ever redefining software developers as brokers again, or creating this list of cryptocurrency traders.
That's great. And I think some other exciting CRAs too we've had are in the energy space, where we'll have the House voting today, I believe, around electric vehicles and some of the mandates we've seen out of the Biden administration, notably the electric vehicle mandate, an area where we've seen a lot of action from the Trump administration. And for people who don't understand how this works, essentially what the Biden administration did are new both fuel economy and tailpipe emission standards, essentially regulating out the existence of gas-powered cars as early as, I believe, 2035 as a target date. And the way California has this authority, and it's subject to interpretation, but the argument is that California can be granted a waiver from the Clean Air Act, which allows California alone to operate with only this power of given to California state. No other state has the ability to do this. So if you hear Democrats start arguing about state rights, you should know it's bogus, because they don't care about state rights, and they're only doing this because they want California to set national climate policy when they're not in power.
Could we get the ATF to require every state to align with Florida's gun laws?
Yeah, right. Exactly. That's the way to think about this, right? California does not have special power to govern the other 49 states. It's not a states' rights issue.
Yeah. So that's up for a vote in the House today?
Yeah, I think there's two separate bills, one more related to cars and the other on kind of commercial trucks as well.
Okay. And then there's also there's the emission standard CRA, which is related but separate rule. And that one has been signed into law, so that was fully overturned. It's the waste emissions charge for petroleum and natural gas systems. I think that was an EPA rule, and that was August Pfluger, representative from Texas, led the effort there. That has passed both houses and been signed. There was the CRA on, this is National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, that had to do with marine wildlife. That one's been signed. I believe that was led by Senator Kennedy from Louisiana, who I would wager knows a bit more about marine wildlife than some bureaucrat in D.C. living as he does near the swamps of Louisiana. And we have one that has passed both houses but not yet been signed. And this was the one led by Representative Andrew Clyde of Georgia. And this is for the labeling requirements on consumer products and commercial equipment. So many of the ways in which the Biden administration has tried to invade the day-to-day transactions and regular course of commerce for the American people, the overregulation, the Mother May I regime for practically everything ranging from AI to car emissions to energy use to fishing to cryptocurrency. These are all being struck down one by one, and they've made tremendous progress in 3 months in making sure that these types of rules can never be passed again in the future.
Yeah, and I think we should highlight, too, how important some of these are for the economy. So it's just some of the key, and I think the energy realm is where a lot of the action has been, but here's just some of the quick Trump actions we've seen in the first 100 days on energy. We've mentioned ending Biden's electric vehicle mandate, but on top of that, it's been the expansion of oil and gas development on federal lands. I think a huge one is they've ended Biden's liquid natural gas export ban. So we're immediately back, just by ending that, to the world's leading exporter of LNG, of liquid natural gas, which is huge. They've opened up ANWR again, which we love because ANWR was originally opened in the 2017 Trump tax cuts. So that's fantastic to see that policy resume. And then, of course, people forget, because Biden re-entered into us, but withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, right? We're not going to we're not going to hold ourselves to European climate standards and become like Europe, having no growth across the continent.
Well, and Mike, I'm a simple man, so would you mind helping me understand a little bit more about ANWR? What does that stand for? And just explain to the folks why that was important.
So this is the Alaska Natural Wildlife Reserve, I believe. But this is essentially, it's a misnomer, because what you're essentially talking about are tundra and marshland, where no one is anywhere near, but where you do have massive oil reserves, or oil ready to be developed, and letting that be opened to extraction and development. Huge for the country. It brings down prices across the board. When you lower the price of energy, you're lowering the price of everything in the economy. So huge for consumers who have lived through Biden inflation, lived through a war on American energy, getting back to the business of taking the government out of the economy.
Yes, and I wanted to, I'm glad you said that, because I was about to get into my John Stossel impression and try and steal man. But why would we want oil drilling near a wildlife refuge? But it's basically a fake wildlife refuge. This is the Arctic tundra. There's very little there. Does this threaten the polar bear population? Have we seen a significant decline in recent years in polar bears?
I think the polar bear's back on the rise.
I think they've doubled in the last 15 years,
there
right?
You go.
And obviously, the senators from Alaska and the members from Alaska have consistently supported this. So again, I feel like they probably have a better sense of what's good for their states and their communities, and certainly what's good for the native corporations and the people who live there. Like they want this.
Democrats need to remember that Alaska became a state. It's not a federal territory anymore. It can be dictated to from D.C. So I think you should let the people in the states make the decision there.
And if you're enjoying the conversation, listen to this dictate from DC, which is to take a moment to rate and review Leave Us Alone on your favorite podcast platform. It's the only federal dictate we encourage you to comply with. It helps us reach more listeners who care about freedom. And don't forget to share this episode with friends who value liberty. Now, back to the discussion.
So, James, we do have a bit of an update here on reconciliation, which is it looks like Republicans in the House are ever so close to actually releasing some of the policy details on tax. I think the Speaker has been urging the Ways and Means Committee to do their markup, where essentially we'll start to see on paper what the tax policy is going to be as early as March 8th, it sounds like. May 8th, where I believe the Speaker said he's comfortable if it slips a little bit beyond that. But the idea is Republicans need to get going fast here. They're certainly right to do that. We have a $4.6 trillion tax increase staring businesses and households down at the end of this year that kicks in automatically. Republicans can't act here. So I think it's certainly time to get moving, but they seem to be doing that. What do you think we should delve into here?
Well, I mean, this is certainly one of the great legislative accomplishments of the first 100 days of the Trump presidency, even though the president doesn't have to sign anything yet, but winning multiple votes on the resolution, getting the budget resolution teed up, as we've covered already in this podcast, and setting them up for success to actually write a bill here. The deadline that everybody in the DC newsletters was mocking, that Speaker Johnson had set for Memorial Day, it's not unrealistic for the House to meet that. They're hashing out the details right now. But as we're getting into the details, I think now would be a great time to introduce our new segment, Good Idea, Bad Idea. And we can rate some of the proposals that have been batted around on the Hill. So why don't we start with a bad idea?
I think the first bad idea, it definitely falls into the terrible idea, which thankfully has been shot down. And that was, as we talked about before, this idea of raising the top individual rate. Mm-hmm. That was floated from anonymous staff in the White House, where you've had the Wall Street Journal and Fox Business doing extensive reporting on this now. I think the Washington Post has joined in as well. But we've seen this before, where you have anonymous people like who went around telling the Senate that Trump did not want one big, beautiful bill, as he had stated publicly, which we know he does. Now you had this idea that, well, now the president is open to raising taxes on small businesses and individuals by letting the top rate expire. We're creating a new millionaire's tax. Well, this floats around for a month until, of course, Trump himself comes out and speaks, along with Newt Gingrich, and says, no, I'm not going to make myself into George H.W. Bush and be I think his quote was the read my lips gang. So that's great to see that the president understands how disastrous it would be to do this. He shut it down. I think this idea is all but dead now, as ATR has been urging it to be shot down. But I think people need to remember this entire exercise on the tax bill. It's about cutting taxes. It's about delivering on Trump's agenda, about preventing the largest tax increase in American history from automatically kicking in. So any idea that we were going to start playing class warfare politics, I think it's been shot down by the president. That's good to see.
Yes, well, the noted Goldman Sachs Hollywood alumnus, great populist, Steve Bannon is still talking about how this is going to happen, but that seems closer and closer to the delusional at this stage.
What's a good idea we can highlight?
Well, a good idea would be spectrum auctions. This is something I've talked about a little bit, but a great pay-for revenue raiser is auctioning off the radio waves that connect all of our devices, that enable all wireless communications. You're probably listening to this right now. If you're listening to it on your earbuds, your AirPods, those are using Bluetooth, which requires spectrum to connect to your device. If you're listening through, I have a little device in my car that through Bluetooth connects to my phone and then broadcasts on a radio wave because I have an old car. So that the radio picks it up, though that's two levels of spectrum. It's two different frequencies that are being used to transmit the data. Wi-Fi transmits data, 5G wireless transmits data. All of this requires spectrum to connect all of our devices. The spectrum is technically owned by the federal government. They auction off licenses to use certain frequencies so they don't interfere with each other. There has been an update where apparently CBO seems to think that this is only going to gross $8 billion in revenue. That's a ridiculously low estimate. Obviously, it depends on how the exact bill is written, but authorizing spectrum auctions from the FCC at this point, it looks like they're going to have to call out specific bands and get very, very into the nitty-gritty in Congress about what needs to be identified, cleared, and put up for auction, because without it, the CBO is not going to accurately score the amount of revenue it's going to bring in. It's probably going to be closer to $100 billion, frankly, when all is said and done, just because there have not been spectrum auctions for the past 3 years, almost 4 years at this point as we get into the summer. The authority to auction lapsed for the first time in 20 years and was not immediately renewed. So there's a lot of pent-up demand that hasn't been met. And if and when this passes, it's probably going to end up being closer to 5 or 6 years by the time all their ducks are in a row and everything's cleared and everyone's ready to actually bid. So we're talking like 5 or 6 years of pent-up demand at a time that's really critical for a lot of these industries to increase their devices and increase their bandwidth. So I think you're going to see a lot more than $8 billion coming in from this. And as we've mentioned, since 1994, they've raised $233 billion total in revenue for the federal government, but $118 billion of that is just since 2018. So this is a really, really good revenue raiser. The demand is clearly growing. And that's not to mention the $240 billion that these auctions ultimately end up producing in gross domestic product that the government doesn't get its hands on, but that enables our economy to grow through greater investment.
And I think you mentioning, too, just how absurdly low this score coming in from CBO is, which, to be clear, right, we're saying doing this, having the government get its hands out of the spectrum business more, the idea would only raise $8 billion when outside estimates are significantly higher this, as you mentioned. This should be a good reminder of how far off the CBO was when it come to scoring Democrat proposals, where they told, the idea that the Inflation Reduction Act was a deficit reduction bill, to then only find out now, well, actually, all the climate provisions in here are actually costing taxpayers about $1 trillion over 10 years. And one of the things we're looking to repeal in this, one of the things we wanted to highlight today, we had a new letter of a coalition of conservative groups out yesterday, organized by Americans for Tax Reform, urging full repeal of the IRA green energy subsidies as, in order to pay for tax cuts in this bill. Opportunity here to do great policy, repeal market distorting subsidies. We're talking about $400 billion in taxpayer credits for things like electric vehicles, for example, all of which should be plowed into good tax cuts that grow the economy, restoring the 2017 Trump tax cuts here. So we had ATR organize this letter, joined by people like Americans for Prosperity, Heritage Action, Club for Growth, and dozens of other good groups. So encourage everyone to go to atr.org and take a look at that letter.
Yes, remarkably, CBO always seems to come up with the best case scenario for tax increases and the worst case scenario in terms of any other revenue raiser or deficit reduction. So every tax credit is not going to cost as much as they say it is, and every tax increase is going to bring in much more revenue than it ends up bringing in. Obviously, some reform is needed here. That's been a long-term bugaboo for many of us who believe in more limited government and greater liberty, lower spending, lower taxes, more economic growth. But something we're going to have to defer to later in the process. Maybe someday we can get that reformed. So, spectrum auctions, good idea. Tax increases, bad idea.
Repealing IRA, good idea.
Good idea. Any other bad ideas? Perhaps
that only lasted. We did have one that thankfully had a very short life here, but it was enough for left-wing media to jump on and for Chuck Schumer to cut a video on, and a reminder of why Republicans have to be careful here. And that was that we had the idea, and you've seen Politico, I think, wrote on the idea of Republicans floating a new car tax in this bill. So what happened was we had the first, the rough draft, essentially, of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee's portion of the tax bill. And that included a new $20 national registration fee for gas-powered cars, all of which would just be not used to go into tax cuts, but plowed into the Highway Trust Fund. And James, if you can remind me, did we not have a massive infrastructure bill under the Biden administration?
Yes, you're giving me Vietnam flashbacks, but yes, when I was a young, green, wet behind the ears Hill staffer, I was involved in that long process in the Senate
Yeah,
side.
so this was the
Yeah,
the bipartisan infrastructure bill.
that was supposed to fix the
Yeah.
Highway Trust Fund for the foreseeable future.
Bipartisan because I believe the House leadership team whipped against it. I think they were able to peel off 8 Republicans in the House,
Mhm.
which is enough to call something bipartisan, I suppose. But yeah, we just had taxpayers fleeced for the idea of doing infrastructure. And we had Amtrak Joe Biden, all of which were plowing it into the Northeast Corridor for Amtrak funding at a complete waste of taxpayers. So any idea now?
Don't forget that we were supposed to solve for rural broadband with the
Yeah.
$42.5 billion subsidy program that has failed to connect a single house in the 4 years
Right.
it has been on the books.
Which was a huge talking point of the Trump campaign. So let's be clear. So thankfully, the car tax idea is not happening because it survived contact with reality for, I think, about 6 hours maybe after people seeing it. So that has already been cut from the bill. But the idea that any Republican should be considering, hey, let's have a new property tax on cars when we have, this is something governors win and lose elections off of. We've seen Republican governor of Virginia, Glenn Youngkin, a top priority of his administration has been trying to repeal Virginia's car tax, where any listeners in Virginia know how stupid that is, even applying to things like leased vehicles. So thankfully, this is an idea that has already been cut out of the bill, but something that should have been off the table from the get-go.
And if Republicans are trying to drain the swamp, vehicle registration and taxing, I mean, that is one of the few areas left that states have managed to cordon off for themselves that the federal government has not interfered with. To be the party that has to own that expansion of a new excise tax effectively on cars,
Yeah.
what are you doing here?
And the starting point, and for what because it's both bad infrastructure policy as well, because the goal of conservatives should be essentially greatly scaling back the role of the Federal Highway Trust Fund. I think states own something like 98% of roads. What this essentially does is just a slush fund to take taxpayer, usually gas tax money, and just funnel it back to states as grants to a political formula.
Which is what they use to strong-arm states into changing other policies, like the reason the drinking age is 21 in every state, which, I mean, this is perhaps opinions vary on this as to what it ought to be, but it used to be that states actually set it was usually 18, and this is what's led to the whole, you can go die for your country, but God forbid you buy cigarettes or a beer. But this was all leveraged through the grants at the Highway Trust Fund to make this happen. So it really does have downstream impacts and all kinds of other laws that ought to be state.
So thankfully, this bad idea of a new national registration fee that would have occurred annually, which is a property tax, that, again, due to widespread pushback from the right, died immediately and has already been taken out of the bill. But a reminder of the stakes of this and that how Republicans should be focused on preventing tax increases, not raising taxes to shore up the Highway Trust Fund. This isn't about the Highway Trust Fund.
Okay, so quick lightning round and a couple more good, bad ideas. The Growth Act. This is tax deferral for dividends to reinvest into...
A good idea, right?
That's a good idea. Yeah, so that was my question. Good or bad idea?
Good idea.
Good idea, okay.
So if you want to tell us a little bit more about it, I think you have a new post coming out, or is it already up?
It'll be up by the time the pod is up on atr.org. Basically explaining this is the bill. It is bipartisan. It's co-sponsored by Terry Sewell from Alabama, I believe, is the Democrat, but the leader is Beth Van Dyne.
Yes.
Okay. So I want to make sure I pronounce that correctly.
Of Texas.
Texas, yes. Former mayor of Irving, Texas.
And current Republican on Ways and Means.
Yes, exactly. And represents a district in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, place near and dear to my heart. But this bill would basically enable mutual funds to be able to reinvest the dividends they give to their investors automatically into the investment vehicle. And this is sort of a passive strategy for doubling down on gains over time as the stock market grows, as it tends to in the long run. And this basically would defer taxes on that so you can reinvest the entirety of your dividend that you're not going to take as it would not treat you as a taxable event, a dividend that you don't actually receive and that you just have reinvested into your...
Tell me if I'm right.
Property.
I think the easiest way to think about this, right, is you should not pay taxes on a mutual fund until you actually sell shares of that mutual fund. Right?
Yeah.
You haven't actually realized the gain yourself as an individual until you sell off part of your mutual fund.
Yeah, exactly. And so typically when you get a dividend, you're not necessarily selling something, but like that, yes, that is a payment you're receiving. But if you're not receiving that payment, if it's just going automatically back into your investment portfolio, then it will help retirees to grow their nest egg over time, but it also will help investment. I mean, so when this was proposed back in 2015, it was scored at $50 billion. And that what that means
over 10 years.
Over 10 years. But what that means is that over 10 years, $50 billion is not getting sucked into the federal government. It is being directly invested into the American economy. And so freeing up $50 billion over 10 years in investment would be fantastic for economic growth.
Yeah, increase investment in the economy, stop the government penalizing investment, key basic goal of conservatives. And I think this would be a great idea for reconciliation.
All right, so Growth Act, good idea. Tax increases, bad idea. Excise tax on cars, bad idea. Should we talk about Medicaid just a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's one of the major parts of this reconciliation, delivering on the Trump tax cuts, as they're searching for areas to spend saving, reduce waste, is going to involve the Medicaid program. And so out of the gate, you already know what the Democrat talking point's going to be. This is going to be Republicans are cutting taxes for the wealthy and corporations in order to strip people of their Medicaid. James, is that what's happening?
Well, as I understand it, they're just trying to make the middle-class tax cuts or the across-the-board tax cuts permanent. I mean, who's receiving a tax break? Is it no tax on tips? Is that a tax break for billionaires? I mean, what is this?
Yeah, of course not. And of course, it's the reason things like the corporate income tax exist is so Democrats can hide the ball on who pays taxes.
Right.
Because we've pointed, there's countless studies. I think pretty much every economist agrees the significant amount of which workers bear the burden of corporate income tax. It's a tax on workers. It's a tax on households and consumers. And it's a tax on investors. We have 161 million Americans invested in the stock market right now, or who have retirement accounts.
Yeah.
So
Tim Apple does not pay the corporate income tax. Yeah. Tim Cook does out of his reduced salary, and we do, and the increased cost of our iPhones. But there's no Mr. General Motors, as Grover likes to put it. But for our modern audience, there's no Tim Apple.
So let's talk about what the actual plan for Medicaid, what Republicans are going to try to do here is. I think the first area we're likely to see will be work requirements for able-bodied people. This is something that shouldn't be controversial at all. If you're able, I think anyone in this country who's able to work should work, period. The idea that we would have taxpayers subsidizing the health care of people who are able to work but are choosing not to, I think is ridiculous and an insult to taxpayers. And I think furthermore, right, it's I think simple pro-growth policy and necessary spending cuts when we have a $37 trillion debt, that we're not going to raise taxes to keep people who are choosing not to work and instead are playing video games in their basement on Medicaid, on government health care.
And we have numbers that's something like 34 million people who were added to Medicaid, I believe, since COVID. Is that correct?
I believe so.
Yeah. But we're talking about these are people who are not going to lose coverage. Work requirements means you have to try to find work while you're receiving Medicaid as a condition of receiving it. They're supported by 81%, is the latest polling we have from the Paragon Institute. 81% of Americans believe this is reasonable and morally right. And when people find work, it's not like they're ever going to lose coverage. We're pushing them to get into the job market so an employer can cover them, not the taxpayer, go into the exchanges that have been set up in the states. And in so doing, you are lowering the burden on the taxpayer to support you through Medicaid. You're getting people connected with the job to experience the dignity of work. You're helping to grow the economy. And you're not actually going to affect any of the service providers who get paid through Medicaid, because those same people, if they have to go to the hospital or they have to go to the doctor, still will, now on insurance that is not footed by the taxpayer. So really, not only will you not affect the reimbursement rates that hospitals get through Medicaid, probably would actually increase them over time if you have fewer recipients who really need it. And so Republicans are now talking about trying to double down on directing the funding of Medicaid towards the people who need it and ensure those who can work are looking for a job and getting into the private healthcare market through their employer, which is usually better coverage anyway.
And as Isabel Marchese of ATR has written, both on the polling, the American people overwhelmingly support work requirements for Medicaid. If you're able to work, you should be working to receive Medicaid. Taxpayers shouldn't be having to fund you. Pretty common sense conservative policy here.
So work requirements, good idea. And a final point, just to bring it full circle, the tax increase on the top bracket was pitched originally as, rather than Medicaid work requirements, which will be demagogued as throwing people off of healthcare, raise taxes on the millionaires. It really was raising taxes on small business owners. But
yeah, and this is the perfect example of raising taxes is not governing. It's the absence of governing. It's refusing to do the hard work of government. What is governing is reforming our broken Medicaid system. So I think this is a perfect example, something conservatives should absolutely be doing, common sense. The American people back with them on this. All right, so that's all for today. That's our episode of the Leave Us Alone podcast. Thank you for tuning in. If you found this discussion valuable, please rate, review, and share the podcast. It helps us reach more freedom-loving listeners. We'll be back next time with more insights on protecting your liberty. And Grover should be rejoining us again next week as well. Thank you. We'll help protect your freedom and keep pushing for government that leaves us alone.